March 14, 1945, 7 kilometers southwest of Kustrin, eastern Brandenburg. The bunker smelled of wet concrete, coal tar, and something else, something organic and sour that clung to the back of the throat. Outside, the temperature hovered just above freezing. Inside, it was colder. Hauptmann Erich Volkmann stood in the narrow corridor of Bunker Complex 7J, a reinforced concrete structure sunk 4 meters into the clay soil of the Oderbruch floodplain. His boots scraped against grit. The single oil lamp mounted to the wall cast shadows that didn't move smoothly. They stuttered, as if the light itself was exhausted. He carried a dispatch case under one arm and a folded requisition form in his gloved hand. The form was stamped with the insignia of the 9th Army's Rear Echelon Medical Command. It authorized the temporary retention of 11 female medical personnel, Soviet and Polish nationals, captured during the collapse of the Vistula Oder offensive. Volkmann paused at the steel door. He could hear nothing from the other side, no voices, no movement, just the faint hydraulic hum of ventilation pumps buried somewhere in the ceiling. He knocked once, no response. He opened it anyway. The room was 3 meters by 5. A single bulb hung from a braided wire. Along the left wall, wooden pallets had been stacked to create makeshift sleeping platforms. Blankets, thin, gray issued, were folded with unsettling precision. On the right, a steel bucket, a tin basin, a crate marked Sanitet's material, medical supplies, sat unopened in the corner. 11 women sat or stood in various states of stillness. Their uniforms were mismatched. Some wore Soviet Medical Corps tunics with torn insignia, others had Polish Red Cross armbands over civilian coats. None of them looked at him. One, a woman in her early 20s with dark hair pulled into a braid, stared at the wall as if reading something written there in a language only she understood. Volkmann had been an artillery officer for 4 years. He had calculated firing solutions for the 15 cm SFH-18 howitzer across 3 fronts. He had coordinated counter-battery operations against entrenched Soviet positions during the winter of 1943. He understood trajectory, deflection, the physics of explosive force. He understood systems. This was not a system he understood. He cleared his throat. "You will be rotated to the surface for 30 minutes at 1400 hours, he said in German. No one moved. He repeated it in broken Russian. Still nothing. One of the older women, perhaps 40, with hollow cheeks and a nurse's cap still pinned crookedly to her hair, finally turned her head. She didn't speak. She just looked at him with an expression that wasn't fear, wasn't defiance. It was something closer to patience. The kind of patience you develop when you've stopped expecting anything to change. Volkmann left the room and locked the door behind him. The bunker had been constructed in late 1944 as part of the Festung Oder defensive network, a scattered line of reinforced positions designed to slow the Soviet advance toward Berlin. Bunker 7J was not a hospital. It was not a holding facility. Officially, it was a forward artillery command post. But by March of 1945, the Eastern Front had become a porous, collapsing membrane. Units merged, dissolved, reassigned. Orders contradicted themselves. Medical personnel captured during rapid Soviet offensives were often detained temporarily, vorübergehend festgehalten, until Rear Echelon Command could determine their classification: combatant, civilian, auxiliary. The word detained appeared in 7 separate field reports reviewed by Volkmann that month. The word held appeared in 11. The word retained appeared in 14. None of the reports used the word prisoner. Between January and April 1945, the 9th Army, tasked with defending the Oder River line, recorded the capture of over 2,000 Soviet auxiliary personnel, including medical staff, supply clerks, and communication operators. Most were processed through re-area camps. Some were transferred westward ahead of the Soviet advance. Others simply disappeared from the logistical record, a gap in the filing system, a clerical error, a convoy that never arrived. Volkmann had asked once what the intended disposition was for the group in Bunker 7J. His superior, Oberstleutnant Gottfried Marr, had looked at him with tired eyes and said, "They are a morale issue. We are managing it." That phrase, morale issue, appeared in the dispatch case Volkmann carried. It appeared in a memo dated March 9th, typed on a field requisition form with a smudged carbon copy. It was never defined. The bombardments came in waves. Soviet artillery, primarily 122 howitzers and Katyusha rocket systems, pounded German positions along a 15-kilometer front every 6 to 8 hours. The bunker shook, dust fell from the ceiling joints, the light bulbs swayed. In those moments, Volkmann could hear them, the women in the lock. Ed room, not screaming, not crying, but breathing. Synchronized, rapid, shallow, the breathing of people who had learned to make themselves small. Between bombardments, there was silence. And in that silence, Volkmann began to understand that he was not managing a logistical problem. He was managing a truth that no one had written down. The system had a logic. It always did. Volkmann had learned this during his training at the Artillerieschule in Jüterbog, where young officers were taught to see warfare not as chaos, but as a sequence of calculable problems. Range tables, powder charges, atmospheric correction, every variable accounted for, every outcome predictable within acceptable margins of error. But the logic governing Bunker 7J was different. It operated in the margins between official orders and unstated practice, between what was documented and what simply occurred. The captured medical personnel had been taken during the final week of February, near the town of Landsberg and Daya Warth, roughly 60 kilometers east of their current location. The Soviet Fifth Shock Army had broken through German defensive positions with overwhelming numerical superiority, 4-1 in infantry, 6-1 in armor. German units retreated in fragmented columns. Roads clogged with vehicles, refugees, wounded soldiers hauled on improvised sleds. In the confusion, a field hospital, operated jointly by Soviet Medical Corps and Polish Red Cross volunteers, was overrun by elements of the 25th Panzergrenadier Division during a brief, desperate counterattack. The counterattack failed within 18 hours, but the hospital staff had already been loaded onto trucks. Standard Wehrmacht protocol, outlined in the 1929 Geneva Convention provisions that Germany had ratified, required that captured medical personnel be repatriated or transferred to neutral authority. They were noncombatants, protected persons. The regulations were clear. But by 1945, clarity had become a luxury the Eastern Front could no longer afford. Volkmann first encountered the group on March 2nd when they arrived at the bunker under armed escort. No paperwork accompanied them. The sergeant who delivered them, a man named Hirsch from a rear security unit, handed Volkmann a handwritten note on a torn piece of grid paper. It said, "Hold until further instruction. Do not process through standard channels." Volkmann asked why. Hirsch shrugged. Orders from Mars office, something about intelligence screening. Intelligence screening, that was the first lie Volkmann noticed, though he didn't call it that yet. None of the women had been interrogated. No intelligence officers visited the bunker. No screening occurred. They were simply kept. The bunker itself was a Type 102V variant, part of a mass production program initiated in 1943 to rapidly expand Germany's defensive infrastructure. Concrete walls 1 meter thick, reinforced with steel rebar salvaged from demolished factories. 2 entrances, one facing west toward German lines, one facing east, sealed with rubble and sandbags. 12 rooms arranged along a central corridor. Ventilation provided by hand-cranked pumps. Emergency egress tunnels, most of which had collapsed or flooded. Volkmann's official duty was fire coordination. He maintained communication with forward observation posts, calculated firing data for the 315 cm howitzers positioned in camouflaged pits 200 meters north of the bunker, and relayed target information to battery commanders. The work was constant. Soviet advances were probing, irregular, designed to identify weak points in the defensive line. Every day brought new coordinates, new corrections, new calculations. But the work was also punctuated by silence, long stretches where the radio crackled with static and nothing else, where the only task was waiting. And in those stretches, Volkmann found himself walking the corridor, pausing outside the locked door, listening. On March 6th, he brought additional rations, black bread, canned meat, ersatz coffee. He opened the door, the same stillness, the same careful arrangement of bodies in space, as if they had learned to occupy as little room as possible. He set the crate down near the entrance. One of the younger women, a girl really, no more than 19, stepped forward. She wore a Soviet medical tunic 2 sizes too large. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked around the knuckles. She spoke in Russian, softly, without looking directly at him. "When will we be transferred?" Volkmann hesitated. He had asked the same question to Ma 3 days earlier. Ma had not answered. He had simply made a notation in a ledger and changed the subject. "I don't know," Volkmann said. The girl nodded, as if she had expected this. She returned to her place along the wall. Later that evening, Volkmann reviewed the documentation again. There were 3 relevant files in his dispatch case. The first was the requisition form authorizing temporary retent. Iron vague, bureaucratic, stamped but not signed. The second was a field memo titled Guidelines for Management of Auxiliary Detainees in Forward Positions. It was 4 pages long, densely written, and contained no actionable instructions. Phrases like situational discretion and localized command authority appeared frequently. The third document was a roster, 11 names written in Cyrillic and then transliterated into German script. Ages, birthplaces, medical specializations. One name stood out: Irina Konstantinova, 24 years old, surgical nurse, native of Smolensk. Noted in the margin, fluent German. Volkmann had not known this. None of the women had spoken German in his presence. He realized then that they had been listening to him the entire time, understanding every word. The bombardments intensified throughout the second week of March. Soviet artillery shifted to a systematic pattern, rolling barrages designed to suppress German positions before infantry assaults. The bunker absorbed the shockwaves. Dust fell in sheets. The light bulb shattered twice and had to be replaced. During one particularly heavy barrage, on March 11th, Volkmann heard something new from the locked room, singing, faint, barely audible beneath the concussive roar above. A Russian folk song, or perhaps a hymn. He couldn't tell. It lasted less than a minute, then stopped. When the barrage ended, Volkmann unlocked the door and stepped inside. They were seated on the pallets, hands folded in their laps, breathing slowly. No one acknowledged him. He scanned the room, counting 11, all present, no injuries, no signs of panic. But something had changed. He could see it in their eyes, not fear, not resignation, but a kind of collective decision. They had stopped expecting rescue. They had stopped expecting anything. Volkmann closed the door and returned to his post. He wrote a brief report for Ma's office, noting the continued detention and requesting clarification on transfer timeline. He used the phrase humanitarian concern in the second paragraph. The report was never answered. By March 15th, Volkmann had developed a routine. He visited the locked room twice daily, once at 800 hours, once at 1900 hours. He brought rations, emptied the waste bucket, checked for signs of illness or injury. He said little. They said less. The interactions lasted no more than 5 minutes. But routines, he learned, were a form of documentation. They left traces. On the morning of March 16th, he arrived to find one of the women unconscious. She lay on the lowest pallet, her face gray, her breathing shallow and irregular. The others had covered her with every available blanket. Irina Konstantinova, the surgical nurse with fluent German, stood near the door, waiting. "She needs a doctor," Irina said in German. Her voice was calm, clinical. "Pneumonia, most likely. Without antibiotics, she will die within 3 days." Volkmann stared at her. It was the first time any of them had spoken to him directly in his own language. "How long has she been like this?" 2 days, we requested help. No one came." Volkmann felt something cold settle in his chest. He had received no such request. He checked the door. No marks, no notes slipped beneath. Either they had called out and been ignored, or their voices had been absorbed by the bunker's thick walls and the constant noise of bombardment. He looked at the woman on the pallet. Her name, according to the roster, was Zofia Kowalska, Polish, 32 years old, pediatric nurse from Krakow. She had survived the German invasion of Poland in 1939, survived 5 years of occupation, survived the chaos of the Eastern Front's collapse. And now she was dying in a concrete box 7 kilometers from Kustrin because no one had written down that she mattered. "I'll get medical supplies," Volkmann said. Irina watched him without expression. "Will you?" He left without answering. The bunker's medical stock was minimal: bandages, iodine, morphine ampules, surgical thread. No antibiotics, no sulfur drugs. Those had been requisitioned weeks earlier for frontline hospitals overwhelmed with casualties. Volkmann sent a radio request to the rear medical depot at Silo, 15 kilometers west. The response came 3 hours later: no available transport. All medical supplies reserved for Wehrmacht personnel. Request denied. Volkmann read the message twice. Wehrmacht personnel, a category that explicitly excluded the women in the locked room, despite their status as medical professionals, despite the regulations governing captured noncombatants, despite every principle outlined in the conventions Germany had once agreed to uphold. He crumpled the message and threw it into the corner. That evening, he returned to the room with his personal medical kit, a small canvas pouch containing aspirin, bandages, a thermometer, and a single vial of camphor oil intended for respiratory relief. He handed it to Irina. "It's not enough, SH. A said. I know." She took the pouch anyway. "Why are we here?" Volkmann had no answer. He had asked himself the same question for 2 weeks. He had reviewed the documentation, searched for the hidden logic, tried to identify the specific order or policy that explained their continued detention. But there was no order, no policy, just a series of small decisions: hold them, don't process them, manage the morale issue, each one deferring responsibility to the next level of command, each one creating distance between action and accountability. It was a system designed to function without anyone being responsible for its outcomes. "I don't know," Volkmann said. Irina looked at him for a long moment. "Yes, you do." She turned away and knelt beside Zofia, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. Volkmann left the room and locked the door behind him. His hands shook as he turned the key. The next day, March 17th, Soviet forces launched a coordinated assault along a 5-kilometer section of the front. Artillery barrage at 5:30 hours, followed by infantry and armor at 6:20. German defensive positions buckled. Volkmann spent 14 hours at his post, calculating firing solutions, relaying coordinates, watching the maps as red symbols advanced westward, meter by meter. The bunker shook continuously. Somewhere above, a near-miss collapsed part of the trench system. Debris rained onto the entrance. The ventilation system failed for 40 minutes, and the air inside grew thick and stale. In the locked room, the women waited. Volkmann could picture them, seated on the pallets, hands folded, breathing slowly in the darkness, making themselves small, waiting for the ceiling to hold. When the barrage finally subsided, Volkmann checked the room. All 11 were alive. Zofia was still unconscious, but her breathing had stabilized slightly. Irina had used the camphor oil, rationed the aspirin, improvised a humidifier using the tin basin, and heated stones from the ventilation shaft. "She might survive," Irina said, "if we're lucky." Volkmann nodded. He wanted to say something, an apology, an explanation, anything to bridge the space between what he knew was happening and what he was allowing to happen. But the words wouldn't form. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been a nurse?" Irina looked at him. "Since 1941, since the war came to my city and I learned that doing nothing is still a choice." The statement hung in the air between them. Volkmann left the room. That night he found a document he had missed during his earlier reviews, a field circular dated February 20th, distributed to all forward command posts along the Oder line. It was titled Interim Procedures for Non-German Auxiliary Personnel in Contested Zones. The language was dense, bureaucratic, filled with conditional clauses and procedural ambiguities. But buried in the third paragraph was a single sentence. In cases where immediate repatriation is unfeasible due to operational conditions, personnel may be retained under local custody pending clarification of status. May be retained, pending clarification, unfeasible. Every word designed to defer, to obscure, to transform a decision into a condition, to make detention sound like a temporary logistical challenge rather than what it actually was. Volkmann understood then that the system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. It created a space where people could be held indefinitely without anyone issuing an explicit order to hold them, where responsibility could be distributed so thinly that no single person could be held accountable, where the absence of clarity became its own justification. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic engineering. And it was killing Zofia Kowalska. Volkmann closed the file and sat in the dim light of his quarters, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. He thought about trajectory and deflection, about the physics of explosive force, about how every shell he had ever fired followed a predictable path from barrel to target. But there was no equation for this, no firing table, no correction factor. Just 11 women in a locked room, and a system that had learned to function without ever acknowledging what it was doing. Zofia Kowalska died on March 19th at approximately 3:40 hours. Volkmann was not present. He learned of it when he opened the door at 800 for the morning inspection. She lay on the lowest pallet, covered completely by a blanket. The other women sat in a semicircle around her silent. No one wept. No one spoke. Irina stood near the body with her hands clasped in front of her, her face empty of expression. Volkmann stared at the shape beneath the blanket. He had calculated the probability of this outcome 3 days earlier, had known the medical supplies were insufficient, had known that his radio request would be denied. He had known, and he had done nothing else. When, he asked. 2 hours ago, Irina said. Her voice was flat, her lungs filled wide. TH fluid. We tried to keep her upright, but she stopped. There was no need to finish. Volkmann nodded slowly. I'll arrange for the body to be removed. Where will you take her? He didn't answer because he didn't know. There was no protocol for this, no form to fill out, no designated burial detail, no chaplain to contact. Zofia Kowalska had existed in a bureaucratic void, and now she had died in one. I'll take care of it, he said. Irina's eyes narrowed. Will you? He left the room. The body was removed that afternoon by 2 soldiers from the rear security unit, the same unit that had delivered the women 17 days earlier. They wrapped Zofia in a canvas tarp, carried her through the corridor, and loaded her onto a cart. Volkmann asked where they were taking her. One of the soldiers, a man named Kessler with a scarred jaw and empty eyes, shrugged. Probably the trench grave behind the motor pool. That's where everything goes now. Everything, not everyone, everything. Volkmann watched the cart disappear down the muddy path toward the rear area. He stood in the cold air for 10 minutes, listening to the distant thump of artillery. Then he returned to the bunker and wrote a report. Date, time, cause of death, disposition of remains. He used the phrase insufficient medical resources in the summary. He did not use the phrase preventable. The report went into his dispatch case, along with all the others. He wondered if anyone would ever read it. That evening, Oberstleutnant Marr arrived at the bunker for an unannounced inspection. He was a thin man in his early 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of posture that suggested chronic back pain. He had commanded artillery battalions in Poland and France before being reassigned to staff coordination duties in 1943, a lateral move that everyone understood as a quiet demotion. He was competent, methodical, and entirely uninterested in problems that did not appear on his requisition forms. Volkmann met him in the command room. Marr removed his cap, brushed dust from his coat, and sat down without invitation. I received your report, Marr said, the one about the detainee. Her name was Zofia Kowalska, Volkmann said. Marr looked at him as if he had said something irrelevant. Yes, I'm aware. This is unfortunate, but not unexpected given the resource constraints we're operating under. He opened a leather folio and withdrew a typed sheet. I'm here to inform you that the situation is being resolved. The remaining detainees will be transferred within 48 hours. Volkmann felt a flicker of something, relief perhaps, or cautious hope. Transferred where? Rear holding facility at Müncheberg. They have medical staff, proper infrastructure. It's the appropriate venue. Why wasn't this done 3 weeks ago? Ma's expression didn't change. Logistics, Hauptmann, everything is logistics. Vehicles are scarce, routes are contested, priorities shift daily. You understand this. Volkmann understood. He understood that logistics was the language people used when they wanted to describe cruelty without calling it that. He understood that words like resource constraints and operational priorities were how systems justified letting people die. He understood that Ma had probably never visited the locked room, never seen the women's faces, never had to explain to Irina why antibiotics existed 10 kilometers away, but could not be spared for a Polish nurse dying in a concrete box. With respect, sir, Volkmann said carefully, one woman is already dead. If the transfer is possible now, it was possible 3 weeks ago. Ma removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. Are you suggesting that command decisions should be second-guessed by junior officers who lack visibility into broader strategic considerations? I'm suggesting that we let someone die for no reason. Ma replaced his glasses. There's always a reason, Hauptmann. You may not see it, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. He stood. The transfer will occur on March 21st. You will prepare the detainees and have them ready for transport at 1400 hours. Understood? Yes, sir. Ma paused at the door. One more thing. I reviewed your personnel file recently. Excellent marks, strong technical aptitude, commendable service record. You have the potential for advancement, provided you focus on your assigned duties and avoid unnecessary entanglements. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. Manage your post, Hauptmann. Don't manage your conscience. That's not what we pay you for. He left. Volkmann sat alone in the command room, staring at the maps on the wall. Red symbols clustered along the front line, each one representing a Soviet unit, divisions, brigades, battalions, numbers and designations, abstractions. He had spent 4 years reducing warfare to abstractions, calculating the most efficient way to deliver high-explosive shells onto map coordinates, transforming human beings into targets and targets into statistics. He wondered when he had stopped noticing. The next morning, March 20th, Volkmann unlocked the door and informed the women of the transfer. They received the news in silence. No relief, no gratitude, no visible emotion. Irina asked a single question. Will we be together? I don't know, Volkmann said. She nodded. Of course you don't. That afternoon, a Soviet barrage struck closer than usual. One shell, a 122 round, impacted 30 meters from the bunker's eastern wall. The concussion shattered the ventilation pump, cracked 2 support beams in the corridor, and caused a partial collapse in the emergency egress tunnel. Dust filled the air. The lights went out for 6 minutes. When Volkmann reached the locked room, he found the women pressed against the western wall, as far from the impact site as possible. One of them, a young woman named Katia, according to the roster, was bleeding from a cut above her eye, struck by falling debris. Irina was already applying pressure with a torn piece of cloth. Volkmann brought his medical kit. Irina cleaned the wound, used the last of the bandages. No one spoke. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of breathing and the distant rumble of follow-up strikes. Volkmann realized in that moment that they had stopped seeing him as a person. He was part of the system now, indistinguishable from the bunker, the locked door, the bureaucratic language that had erased their names and replaced them with the word detainees. He was the man who brought food and emptied the bucket and said he didn't know. He was the mechanism. And mechanisms don't apologize. When the barrage ended, Volkmann locked the door and returned to his post. He received a radio message at 19:20 hours. The transfer scheduled for March 21st had been postponed. No explanation, no new date, just postponed indefinitely due to operational developments. He read the message 3 times. Then he walked to Ma's office and demanded an explanation. Ma wasn't there. His adjutant, a young lieutenant named Vogel, told Volkmann that Soviet forces had cut the road to Müncheberg that morning. No transport could get through. The transfer was impossible. For how long? Volkmann asked. Vogel shrugged. Until the road is clear, or until we retreat, whichever comes first. Volkmann returned to the bunker. He did not go to the locked room. He couldn't. He sat in his quarters and tried to calculate how many days they had left before the Soviets reached this position. 2 weeks, maybe 3. And when the front collapsed, when German forces pulled back toward Berlin, what would happen to the women in the locked room? Would someone remember to unlock the door? The front began to collapse on March 23rd. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, grinding way that characterized the final months of the war in the East. Soviet forces punched through defensive positions at 3 separate points along the Oder line. German units withdrew in stages, orderly at first, then increasingly chaotic as communication networks fragmented and supply lines disintegrated. Volkmann received the evacuation order at 6:20 hours on March 25th. All non-essential personnel were to withdraw to secondary positions near Silo Heights, 20 kilometers west. Artillery units would displace in sequence, covering the retreat. Bunker 7J was to be abandoned by 1800 hours. The order said nothing about detainees. Volkmann read the directive twice, searching for the paragraph he knew wasn't there. He walked to the communications room and sent a coded message to Ma's headquarters. Request clarification on disposition of detained medical personnel currently held at Bunker 7J. The response came back 40 minutes later. No current directives. Use discretion. Use discretion. 2 words that transferred complete responsibility while providing no actual guidance. A masterpiece of institutional cowardice. Volkmann stood in the empty corridor, listening to the sound of soldiers packing equipment in the rooms above. Boots on concrete, voices calling out inventories, the mechanical scrape of ammunition crates being dragged toward the exits. The bunker was being systematically emptied, reduced to an abandoned shell that would be overrun within days, perhaps hours. And in the locked room, 10 women waited. He walked to the door, unlocked it, stepped inside. They were already standing, as if they had been expecting this. Irina stood at the front, her posture straight, her hands at her sides. The others formed a loose group behind her. They had gathered their few possessions, the thin blankets, a few salvaged pieces of cloth, nothing else. They owned nothing else. "We are leaving," Irina said. It wasn't a question. Volkmann nodded. "The bunker is being evacuated. Soviet forces will be here within 24 hours. And us?" He hesitated. This was the moment where the system's elegant design revealed its true function. He could lock the door and leave. He could follow his orders, withdraw with his unit, and let the advancing Soviet forces discover the room in a day or 2. The women would survive. They were Soviet and Polish nationals after all. They would be liberated, reunited with their own forces, returned to field hospitals or reassigned. Problems solved. Except that no one had ordered him to lock the door. No one had ordered him to leave them. No directive existed because the system had learned that the most efficient way to make people disappear was to simply stop acknowledging their existence. Let them fall through the gap between one order and the next. Let time and circumstance handle the problem. Use discretion. "You're coming with us," Volkmann said. Irina stared at him. "What?" "You're coming with the evacuation convoy. I'm not leaving you here." One of the other women, an older nurse named Anya, with gray streaks in her hair, spoke for the first time in 3 weeks. Her voice was hoarse, uncertain. "You're releasing us." "No," Volkmann said. "I don't have authority to release you, but I'm not going to lock this door and walk away." Irina's expression shifted, not to relief, not to gratitude, but to something more complicated. Suspicion, maybe, or recognition that this wasn't mercy. This was one small decision made in opposition to 1,000 larger ones, and it wouldn't change what had already happened. It wouldn't bring Zofia back. It wouldn't erase 3 weeks in a locked room. Why? Irina asked. Volkman didn't have an answer that would satisfy either of them. He thought about Ma's words, "Don't manage your conscience. That's not what we pay you for." He thought about the bureaucratic language that had allowed this to happen without anyone being responsible. He thought about trajectory and deflection, about systems designed to function efficiently regardless of their human cost. "Because I'm done using discretion," he said. The evacuation began at 14:30 hours. German forces moved in columns, artillery tractors towing guns, trucks loaded with ammunition and supplies, infantry units marching in loose formation. The roads were clogged with military vehicles and civilian refugees fleeing westward. The sky was overcast, the temperature just above freezing. Mud sucked at boots and tires. Volkman placed the 10 women in a supply truck near the rear of the convoy. He told the driver, a corporal named Angel, that they were medical personnel being transferred to the field hospital at Silo. He didn't mention that they were detainees. He didn't mention that no transfer order existed. Angel looked at the women, then at Volkman. "They don't look Germans." "They're auxiliaries," Volkman said. "Just drive." Angel shrugged and climbed into the cab. The convoy moved slowly, stopping frequently to navigate destroyed bridges and cratered roads. Soviet aircraft appeared twice, Ilyushin Il-2 ground attack planes that strafed the column with cannon fire. Vehicles scattered off the road. 3 trucks were destroyed, their contents burning in the ditches. Volkman watched from his position near the command vehicle, counting the trucks ahead, making sure the one carrying the women was still moving. They reached Silo at 21:30 hours. The town was chaos, a staging area for retreating units, a collection point for wounded soldiers, a nexus of contradictory orders and collapsing authority. Field hospitals operated out of commandeered buildings. Supply depots distributed ammunition and rations from rapidly dwindling stocks. Officers shouted into radios, trying to coordinate a defense that everyone knew was already lost. Volkman found the medical officer in charge, a surgeon named Dr. Brandt, who looked like he hadn't slept in 4 days. Volkman explained that he had 10 medical personnel, trained nurses, available for immediate assignment. Brandt barely looked at them. "Can they work?" "Yes." "Then put them in Building 7. We need anyone with medical training. I don't care where they came from." He turned away, already moving on to the next crisis. Volkman led the women to Building 7, a former schoolhouse converted into an overflow ward. The interior was packed with wounded soldiers on stretchers, on cots, on the floor. The smell of blood and disinfectant was overwhelming. 2 nurses moved between patients, checking wounds, administering morphine, changing dressings. They were drowning in work. Irina surveyed the room. Then she turned to the other women and spoke in Russian. They spread out immediately, each moving to a different section of the room, kneeling beside wounded men, assessing injuries, beginning the work they had been trained to do. No one questioned their presence. No one asked for authorization. In the chaos of collapse, competence was the only credential that mattered. Volkman watched them work for several minutes. Irina cleaned a shrapnel wound on a young soldier's leg with steady hands. Anya prepared an injection of morphine for a man with half his face wrapped in bandages. Katya, the girl who had been injured in the bunker, held the hand of a dying lieutenant while he whispered something in a language Volkman couldn't hear. They moved with efficiency, with focus, with the kind of practiced professionalism that comes from years of working under impossible conditions. They saved no one's life that night. Most of the men in that room were too far gone for saving, but they reduced suffering. They provided comfort. They did the work that systems don't account for, that logistics reports don't measure, that bureaucratic language doesn't have words for. Volkman left the building and walked to the command post. He filed a brief report noting the arrival of auxiliary medical personnel and their assignment to field hospital duties. He used vague language, provided minimal details. He knew the report would be lost within hours, buried in the avalanche of paperwork generated by a collapsing front. But he wrote it anyway, Because if someone later asked what happened to the women from Bunker 7J, there would be a document, a trace, evidence that they had existed, that they had mattered, that someone had noticed. 3 days later, on March 28th, Soviet forces reached Silo. The German defensive line broke. Units scattered. Volkmann's artillery battery was overrun. He was captured on March 30th, along with thousands of other German soldiers, and spent the next 4 years in a Soviet labor camp in the Urals. He never saw the women again. In 1952, after his release and return to West Germany, Volkmann tried to find out what had happened to them. He contacted the Red Cross, searched through displaced persons' records, wrote letters to Soviet authorities requesting information about Polish and Soviet medical personnel who had served in the final weeks of the war. He found nothing, no records, no names. The women from Bunker 7J had disappeared into the same bureaucratic void that had created them. All except one. In 1958, Volkmann received a letter forwarded through multiple addresses. The envelope was postmarked Krakow. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in careful German. Hauptmann Volkmann. I don't know if you remember me. My name is Irina Konstantinova. I was held in your bunker in March 1945. I wanted you to know that 9 of us survived the war. We were separated after Silo. The chaos made it impossible to stay together. Most returned to the Soviet Union. 2 stayed in Poland. I remained in Krakow. I think about Zofia often. I think about those weeks in the bunker. I think about why you opened the door when you could have left it locked. I have no answer, but I wanted you to know that it mattered. IK. Volkmann kept the letter for the rest of his life. He never responded because he didn't know what to say. Erich Volkmann died in 1987 at the age of 71 in a small apartment in Düsseldorf. He had worked for 30 years as a civil engineer, designing water treatment facilities and municipal infrastructure. He married late, had no children, and rarely spoke about the war. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept precise records, who maintained his garden with methodical care, who walked to the corner bakery every Sunday morning at exactly 800 hours. They did not know that he kept a locked drawer in his desk containing a folder of documents from 1945, requisition forms, field memos, a roster with 11 names, a letter postmarked Krakow. After his death, his nephew, a university student named Michael, sorted through the apartment. He found the folder and read its contents. He didn't understand most of it. The documents were bureaucratic, dense, written in the formal language of military administration. But he recognized the letter, and he recognized something else. His uncle's handwriting in the margins of the documents, small annotations made years after the war. Next to the phrase, "may be retained pending clarification," Volkmann had written, "no clarification ever came." Next to the phrase, "morale issue," he had written, "whose morale?" Next to the phrase, "use discretion," he had written, "the language of cowards." Michael donated the documents to the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, where they were catalogued and filed among thousands of similar records from the Eastern Front. They remained there, largely unexamined, for another 20 years. In 2009, a historian named Dr. Elizabeth Henner was researching patterns of detention and treatment of Soviet medical personnel during the final months of the war. She was particularly interested in the bureaucratic mechanisms that allowed violations of Geneva Convention provisions to occur without explicit orders, without formal policy changes, without anyone in the chain of command being held accountable. She found Volkmann's documents. What struck her immediately was not the brutality she had seen far worse in other archives, but the ordinariness, the banal language, the administrative precision with which human beings were transformed into logistical problems. The way responsibility was distributed so thoroughly that it ceased to exist in any identifiable form. "This is how atrocity happens in modern systems," she wrote in her 2011 study, Spaces of Erasure, Detention Practices on the Eastern Front, 1944–1945. Not through the sadism of monsters, but through the efficiency of bureaucrats. Not through explicit orders to commit evil, but through vague directives that create spaces where evil becomes administratively convenient. Her research identified at least 47 similar cases along the Oder front, instances where captured medical personnel, predominantly Soviet and Polish women, were detained in forward positions under ambiguous authority, held without clear legal status, and subjected to conditions that ranged from neglect to systematic abuse. In most cases, no records survived. The women simply disappeared from the administrative record, erased by the same bureaucratic mechanisms that had detained them. Henna's work was disputed by some military historians who argued that she was imposing contemporary ethical standards on wartime conditions, that the chaos of retreat and the resource constraints of a collapsing army explained the failures without requiring sinister motives. They pointed out that Soviet forces had committed far worse atrocities, that the Eastern Front was a theater of unparalleled brutality, that every nation involved had violated the conventions of war. All of which was true, and all of which was irrelevant. Because what Volkmann's documents revealed was not that German forces on the Eastern Front committed atrocities, that was well established. What they revealed was the mechanism, the way institutions create plausible deniability through linguistic abstraction, the way responsibility can be diffused until it becomes impossible to identify who decided that 11 women should be locked in a bunker for 3 weeks. The way systems can produce cruelty without requiring cruel people, just people following procedures, managing logistics, using discretion. Volkmann understood this by 1945. It took historians another 60 years to develop the theoretical framework to describe what he had witnessed. In 2017, a documentary filmmaker named Jonas Werner traveled to the site of Bunker 7. The location was now farmland, flat and featureless, bisected by drainage ditches. The bunker itself had been demolished in the 1950s during post-war reconstruction. Nothing remained except a slight depression in the earth and a few fragments of concrete foundation barely visible beneath the topsoil. Werner interviewed local residents. No one remembered the bunker. No one had heard stories about captured nurses or detained medical personnel. The war had passed through this landscape like a storm, violent and absolute, and then receded, leaving behind only silence. He did find one elderly woman, Frau Bergmann, 93 years old, who had been a teenager in 1945. She remembered the retreat, the convoys, the sound of artillery. She remembered Soviet soldiers arriving in late March, searching buildings, rounding up German civilians and soldiers who hadn't escaped. "Did you ever hear about women being held in the bunkers?" Werner asked. Frau Bergmann frowned, thinking, there were always rumors. People talked about things they'd seen or heard, but no one knew for certain. And after the war, no one wanted to talk about it anymore. We were all just trying to survive. Werner asked what she thought about the stories now, decades later. She looked out the window of her small kitchen toward the fields where the bunker had once stood. "I think terrible things happened everywhere, and I think most of them we'll never know about. The people who could have told us are dead. The documents were destroyed or lost. All we have left are gaps." She paused. "Gaps where people used to be." That phrase, "gaps where people used to be," became the title of Werner's documentary. It premiered at a film festival in Berlin in 2018 and was largely ignored. Critics found it slow, overly focused on bureaucratic details, lacking dramatic narrative momentum. Audiences preferred documentaries about resistance heroes or spectacular battles or clear moral narratives with identifiable villains. But a few people understood what Werner was trying to show, that the gaps matter, that the administrative silence is itself a form of violence, that the stories erased by bureaucratic language are the ones that reveal how systems of oppression actually function, not through evil masterminds issuing orders, but through ordinary people making small decisions that accumulate into monstrous outcomes. Volkmann made one such decision on March 25, 1945, when he opened a locked door instead of walking away. It was a small decision, easily overlooked in the vast catastrophe of the war's final weeks. It didn't change the outcome. F the war, It didn't prevent other atrocities. It didn't erase what had already happened in that bunker. But it created a record, a trace, evidence that someone had noticed, had refused, had chosen differently. And 60 years later, that trace allowed historians to reconstruct not just what happened in Bunker 7J, but how it was allowed to happen. To identify the linguistic patterns, the bureaucratic structures, the institutional mechanisms that transform human beings into administrative problems, and then erase them through procedural indifference. Those mechanisms did not end in 1945. In 2019, journalists investigating detention centers for asylum seekers along the US-Mexico border found similar patterns: vague directives, diffused responsibility, administrative language that transformed suffering into logistics. In 2020, researchers examining the treatment of Uyghur populations in Chinese internment camps identified nearly identical bureaucratic structures. The use of terms like re-education, vocational training, temporary retention pending assessment. In 2021, human rights organizations documented the systematic detention of refugees in Australian offshore processing facilities, held in administrative limbo for years under policies that created legal black holes where accountability disappeared. Different contexts, different countries, different populations, same mechanism. The language changes, detainees becomes irregular migrants, becomes persons of interest, becomes individuals pending processing. But the function remains constant: to create administrative spaces where people can be held, harmed, or erased without anyone being responsible. Volkmann recognized this in 1945. He saw how the system worked, how it distributed guilt until guilt became invisible, how it used discretion as a weapon. He couldn't stop it. He didn't even try, not for 3 weeks. But at the last moment, he refused to participate in the erasure. It was the smallest possible resistance, and it was everything. Because the alternative, locking the door and walking away, would have worked. The women would have survived anyway, liberated by Soviet forces within 48 hours. His decision changed nothing tactically, nothing strategically, nothing in terms of the war's outcome. But it changed the record. It meant that when historians opened the archives decades later, they found evidence not just of the system's cruelty, but of the possibility of refusal. Proof that even within institutions designed to eliminate individual responsibility, individuals still made choices. Those choices mattered. They always do. The folder that Volkmann kept for 42 years, the annotations he made in the margins, the letter he preserved, these were his testimony. Not a justification, not an excuse, but a statement: this happened, I was part of it, I saw the mechanism, and at the end I chose differently. That testimony survives. The gaps remain. We will never know the full stories of the women in Bunker 7J, never hear their voices in their own words, never fully understand what those 3 weeks cost them. But we know they existed. We know their names. We know that someone noticed. And in a system designed to make people disappear through administrative silence, that knowledge is itself an act of resistance. The bunker is gone, the war is over, the people are dead. But the mechanism remains, and so does the choice.